The stagecoach rattled into Redstone Bluff on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, trailing a long plume of Texas dust behind it like a reluctant confession. The town barely looked up. Stagecoaches came and went. So did people, more often than not. But when the door swung open and Aina stepped down onto the packed dirt street, a few heads turned. She was 26, with dark eyes that took in everything quietly and a posture that suggested she had been raised in rooms with high ceilings. Her traveling dress was deep blue, slightly dusty from the road but still unmistakably fine. She carried a leather satchel over one shoulder, and a stack of books tucked against her side like they were old friends she refused to leave behind. She stood still for a moment on the street, looking at the weathered storefronts, the water trough, the hand-painted sign reading Redstone Bluff, Pop. 312, and she took one slow, steady breath. Then she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not the brittle kind that people paste on when they are secretly considering turning back. A real one, small and private, aimed at nothing and no one in particular. As though the dust and the heat and the rough edges of the place had introduced themselves, and she had decided she liked them well enough. Mrs. Della Finch was waiting beside the post, and she was not a woman who missed much. "You must be our new schoolteacher," she said, looking Aina up and down with the efficient appraisal of someone who has sized up 1,000 strangers and been right about most of them. "Aina," she said, shifting the books to extend her hand. "And yes, that's me." Mrs. Finch shook it firmly. "Della Finch. I run the boarding house, the best table in town and most of the useful conversation. Come along, then. I'll get you settled before the welcome gathering tonight." As they walked the short length of the main street, Mrs. Finch provided what she called the essentials. The general store was run by old Pete Morrow, who was hard of hearing and harder of personality but fair in his weights. The mayor, Gerald Whitfield, was the large man she'd see tonight who would shake her hand too long and talk at considerable length about himself. The schoolhouse was at the east end of town, recently patched after a hailstorm, and the children, she was warned, were spirited. "Spirited," Aina repeated. "Feral," Mrs. Finch clarified pleasantly. "But good-hearted, most of them. You'll manage, I think. You've got steady eyes. I trust steady eyes." Aina laughed, and Mrs. Finch decided on the spot that she approved of the new schoolteacher. The boarding house was clean and warm, with a patchwork quilt on the bed that looked hand-stitched by someone who had taken great care with it. Aina set her books on the windowsill, washed the road off her face, and looked out at the street below for a moment. A hawk circled lazily overhead. A boy chased a dog around a barrel. Somewhere, a horse complained loudly about something. It was nothing like Boston. She found she didn't mind at all. The welcome gathering was held in the town hall, which doubled as a meeting room, a dance floor, and apparently a storage space for 3 broken chairs that no one had gotten around to removing. Mayor Whitfield had hung a paper banner that read "Welcome Teacher" in large, enthusiastic letters. He greeted Aina at the door with exactly the handshake Mrs. Finch had predicted. The room held perhaps 40 people. Ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers, a few cowboys lingering near the back wall with their hats in their hands, and a cluster of children who had been instructed to behave and were giving it their best effort with mixed results. Aina moved through the room with quiet warmth, learning names, asking questions she actually wanted the answers to. She was good with people. She always had been. It was one of the reasons teaching had felt not like a profession but like a calling. Mrs. Finch had set up a small refreshment table against the far wall, coffee, lemonade, and a proper pot of tea that she had made with visible pride. "I ordered those leaves from the catalog," she told Aina quietly. "Don't let anyone put sugar in it." It was while Aina was carefully loading a small tray with teacups to carry to a group of ranchers' wives that she first became aware of Cole Hargrove. She became aware of him the way you become aware of weather coming, not because he announced himself, but because the room shifted slightly around him. Conversations near the back wall dipped lower. A couple of cowboys stepped aside without quite knowing they'd done it. He stood near the corner with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, broad-shouldered and still, wearing a dark shirt that was clearly his best one, pressed, unwrinkled, out of place on a frame that was built for open range and hard work. His face was all straight lines and shadow. He was not scowling. He simply looked like a man who had stopped expecting much from any given room and had made his peace with that. He was, Mrs. Finch had told her earlier with a tone that closed the subject firmly, not to be bothered. Cole Hargrove, largest ranch in the county, hadn't smiled in 3 years, not since the fever took his wife and his boy on the same terrible week in the winter of 1871. The town had quietly learned to leave him to his silence. Aina glanced at him once briefly and then turned her attention back to the tea tray. She should have kept her attention on the tea tray. She turned to navigate toward the ranchers' wives, the tray balanced carefully in both hands, just as Cole shifted away from the wall and moved toward the door. It was a small miscalculation. A single step she hadn't expected. Her elbow caught the edge of the table, the tray tilted, and one full porcelain cup of hot tea lifted, arced, and landed squarely in the center of Cole Hargrove's best-pressed shirt. The room stopped. Every conversation, every clink of cup against saucer, every shuffling boot heel, all of it ceased at once, replaced by a silence so complete it had weight. 40 people held a collective breath. Several of the cowboys near the back wall took a small, instinctive step backward. Aina looked up. Cole looked down at his shirt. Then he looked at her. She did not flinch. Her face was mortified, genuinely, visibly so, but she held his gaze and said, clearly and without stumbling, "I am so terribly sorry. That was entirely my fault, and I am sorry." Cole said nothing. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. Someone near the refreshment table made a small, strangled sound. And then so small that half the room wasn't sure they'd seen it, something shifted at the corner of Cole Hargrove's mouth. Not a smile, not yet, but the ghost of one. A single crack in 3 years of stone there and gone in less than a heartbeat. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he gave a single, slow nod, turned, and walked out of the town hall into the evening air. The room exhaled. Mrs. Finch appeared at Aina's elbow with a cloth, her eyes wide. "In 15 years," she whispered, "I have never seen that man's face move." Aina looked at the door he'd walked through, the empty cup still in her hand. "I'll apologize properly tomorrow," she said. But even as she said it, she was thinking about that almost smile. That small, reluctant, barely there thing that had crossed his face like the first light before a sunrise, gone before you could be sure it had been there at all. She was, without entirely meaning to, already curious. The schoolhouse smelled like chalk dust and pine wood, and the particular restless energy of 17 children who would rather be anywhere else. Aina loved it immediately. She had arranged the desks herself the evening before school began, dragging them into a loose semicircle, rather than the rigid rows she'd found them in. She'd pinned a map of the United States above the chalkboard, set a small glass jar of wildflowers on her desk, and written 3 words in large, careful letters across the top of the board: "Curiosity is courage." The children arrived in waves, some scrubbed and nervous, some mud-speckled and indifferent, all of them sizing her up with the unfiltered honesty that only children and old ranch hands truly possess. She greeted each one by name, having memorized the role Mrs. Finch had helpfully provided. The last to arrive was Tommy Reyes. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the exact color of storm clouds, which told Aina everything she needed to know about whose nephew he was before anyone confirmed it. He sat in the back row, arms crossed, and looked at the wildflowers on her desk as though they had personally offended him. "Tommy," she said, not making a show of it. "Miss," he muttered and looked at the wall instead. She let him be, for that day. By the end of the first week she understood the shape of the challenge. Tommy was not slow, he was, in fact, sharp as a new tack when he forgot to be difficult. But he read haltingly, stumbling over longer words with a frustration he covered immediately with hostility, throwing his reader down on the desk and declaring reading to be useless for ranching. The other children glanced at him sidelong. Aina simply picked the book back up, set it in front of him again, and said, "Read me the next line, just that one." He glared at her, she waited. He read the line. Good, she said, and moved on as though nothing had happened. No celebration, no drama, just the quiet insistence that he could and therefore he would. After school on Thursday, she stayed late to organize her materials. She found Tommy still at his desk, hunched over the reader he'd claimed to despise, his lips moving slightly as he worked through a passage. He looked up and caught her watching. The shutters came down immediately. "Lost my hat," he said. "It's on your head," she replied. A long pause. Then the absolute smallest suggestion of a smile swiftly suppressed. He grabbed his reader, shoved it into his bag, and walked out. Aina looked at the empty doorway and felt the particular satisfaction of a nail catching on the third strike. It was the following Tuesday when Cole came to collect him. School had run long. She'd been reading aloud from a collection of frontier stories that had proved so popular that not a single child had moved toward the door at the sound of the late bell. She was mid-sentence when the afternoon light shifted, and she looked up to find Cole Hargrove standing in the open doorway. He had not knocked. He'd simply arrived, the way weather arrived, and stood there with his hat in his hands watching the room. His eyes moved over the semicircle of desks, the map, the wildflowers, and finally landed on Tommy, who was sitting 2 rows from the front, considerably closer than the back row he'd claimed on the first day, leaning forward with his elbows on his desk and his chin in his hands, entirely absorbed in the story. Tommy laughed at something in the passage. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind a child produces before he remembers he is supposed to be difficult. Aina watched Cole's face. She saw it, the same thing the town hall had shown her, but slower this time and deeper. Something that moved through his expression like a hand passing over still water. He looked at his nephew laughing in a schoolroom, and for just a moment the straight lines of his face arranged themselves into something almost gentle. He noticed her watching and the expression shuddered immediately. "School's done," he said, addressing the room. Tommy straightened up. Several children looked between the imposing rancher in the doorway and their teacher with undisguised interest. Aina set down her book calmly. "Just finishing a chapter," she said. "2 more minutes, Mr. Hargrove." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. People did not, apparently, give Cole Hargrove 2 more minutes as though it were a reasonable and ordinary thing to say. He said nothing. He waited in the doorway. She finished the chapter. 3 days later, she arrived at the schoolhouse to find the broken window latch, the one she had submitted a written repair request about to Mayor Whitfield 2 weeks prior, to no response, neatly fixed. New hardware, cleanly installed, no note left, no credit claimed. She ran her finger along the new latch and said nothing about it to anyone. She did, however, place a book on Tommy's desk that afternoon with a folded note tucked inside the front cover. The note read, "For the rancher who wants to know about cattle grazing rotations, Chapter 7 is particularly useful." She addressed it to Tommy in case anyone asked. She was fairly certain Tommy would not read Chapter 7 of a land management text unprompted. 2 weeks later, the book reappeared on her desk, returned without comment. Chapter 7 had been read. She could tell by the slight wear on the spine, the page corners subtly softer than the rest. She smiled at it privately and put it back on her shelf. Their first real conversation happened at Pete Morrow's general store on a gray Wednesday morning when they reached for the same jar of ink at the same moment and both stopped with their hands 2 inches apart above the shelf. Cole withdrew his hand. "Go ahead," he said. "I only need a small amount," she said. "I could share the jar." He looked at her the way he seemed to look at most things, with a measuring kind of patience, like a man deciding whether a fence post was set deep enough to trust. "I've got cattle to see to," he said. "It takes 10 seconds to divide ink," she replied pleasantly. He bought the jar. She produced a small empty bottle from her satchel. She was, it turned out, the kind of person who carried small empty bottles, and he divided the ink with careful, unpracticed courtesy as though performing a social ritual in a foreign language. She asked about the ranch. He gave her 3 words: cattle, land, fence. She asked a better question. He gave her a sentence. She asked another. He gave her 2. It was not a conversation so much as the very first draft of one. But she left the store with her ink and the distinct impression that underneath 3 years of deliberate quiet, Cole Hargrove had things he wouldn't mind saying to someone who actually wanted to hear them. The town noticed, naturally. Mrs. Finch reported an uptick in speculation over the supper table. Mayor Whitfield mentioned to 3 separate people that he hoped the schoolteacher was maintaining appropriate professional focus. Cole heard 2 ranchers talking at the fence post outside the saloon one afternoon as he tied up his horse. He wasn't meant to hear it. The words were careless and certain. A fine city lady like that, back east before the first snow, world leaves you, Hargrove. That's just what it does. He stood very still for a moment with his hand on the saddle horn. Then he walked into the saloon without stopping, ordered nothing, and walked back out. He didn't go by the schoolhouse that week, didn't come for Tommy early, didn't stop at the general store on Wednesday. Aina noticed the absence the way you notice when a sound you've grown used to suddenly stops. She stood at the window of the schoolhouse on Friday afternoon watching Tommy walk alone down the road toward the ranch, and she felt the quiet withdrawal of something that had only barely begun. She picked up her chalk. She turned back to the board. She was not, she decided, the kind of person who was discouraged by a step backward. She had moved across an entire country for a life worth living. She could afford patience. She wrote tomorrow's lesson on the board in long, careful letters and went back to work. The storm came in from the northwest with no particular warning, the way the worst things often do. One moment the afternoon sky was the usual pale Texas blue, and the next it had turned the color of a bruised, deep purple at the edges, greenish-yellow at the center, moving fast and low over the flat open land like something with intention. The wind arrived before the clouds did, rattling the schoolhouse windows in their frames and lifting loose papers from desks in a single dramatic sweep. Aina looked at the sky through the west-facing window and made her decision in approximately 4 seconds. "Nobody leaves," she said clearly, over the sudden noise of wind against the walls. "We're staying here until it passes. Everyone move your desks to the center of the room, away from the windows. Quickly and calmly, please." 17 children looked at the sky, looked at her and moved. There was something in her voice when she meant something, a steadiness that didn't ask for debate, and the children had learned it by now. Even Tommy, who had been halfway to the door with his bag already on his shoulder, turned back and helped the younger ones drag their desks inward without being asked twice. The storm arrived in full force 20 minutes later. Rain came sideways against the glass. Thunder rolled across the prairie in long, continuous waves that seemed to have no beginning and no end, and the smaller children pressed together in the center of the room with wide eyes. Aina lit every lamp she had, pulled the curtains across the rattling windows, and sat herself down on the edge of her desk facing the semicircle of frightened faces. "Who wants a story?" she said. 14 hands went up. 2 of the older boys kept their hands down on principle and then inched closer anyway. She read to them for 2 hours. She read about explorers and sea voyages and a girl in England who solved a mystery involving a missing horse, and she did the voices, all of them, without embarrassment. The thunder became part of the atmosphere. The younger children stopped flinching at it. By the time the rain had eased from a roar to a steady murmur, 3 of the smallest had fallen asleep against each other in a row like tilted fence posts, and the rest were half-lidded and warm in the lamplight. Tommy was asleep beside her desk, his cheek against his folded arms, his face completely unguarded for the first time she had ever seen it. He looked in that moment exactly like what he was, a small boy who was very tired of carrying things that were too heavy for him. Aina had just turned a page when the schoolhouse door opened. Cole stood in the doorway with water running off the brim of his hat and his shirt soaked through to the skin. He had clearly ridden hard. His eyes went to Tommy first, found him sleeping and unharmed, and something in his frame released, almost imperceptibly, like a knot working itself loose. Then he looked at the rest of the room. 17 children, safe and warm, lit amber by lamplight, the curtains drawn, the desks rearranged with quiet practicality. And Aina sitting on the edge of her desk with an open book in her lap, watching him with an expression that was neither startled nor performative. Just steady, just present. Cole stood in the doorway for a long moment with water dripping from his hat brim, and he did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Something moved through him quietly and completely, the way water moves through dry ground, not flooding, just filling spaces that had been empty long enough that he'd stopped noticing their shape. He looked away first. "Storm's breaking," he said, to the room in general. "There's coffee," she said. "It's not very good, but it's hot." He came inside. The children's parents arrived in ones and twos as the storm thinned out, each one finding their child safe and being handed back with the particular warm efficiency of a woman who had spent the last 2 hours being entirely competent. The last family left near 9 o'clock. Tommy slept on. The road back to the ranch was running with water and the creek crossing would be impassable until morning, which meant Cole was staying. He settled outside under the deep overhang with the horses, which was the only reasonable arrangement, and Aina brought him the bad coffee and a biscuit from her lunch tin without making anything of it. She was banking down the lamps when he appeared in the doorway again, hat in hand. "I'll keep watch out here," he said. "You should sleep." "I'm not tired," she said, which was not entirely true. He looked at her for a moment, then came and sat in the chair nearest the door as far across the room as the room allowed, and they were quiet together for a while in the way that requires a certain amount of trust between two people. Then he told her about his wife, Sarah. He didn't lead into it or explain why he was saying it. He simply said her name and a few things after it, quietly and without theater. That she had laughed loudly and without apology. That she had made the ranch feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. That the fever had taken her and their son Daniel in the same week, and that the world had been a much louder, emptier place since then, in a way that made no logical sense but was true regardless. Aina listened. She did not say "I'm so sorry" in the soft, withdrawing way people said it when they wanted the subject to end. She simply listened with her full attention, the way she listened to everything, as though what he was saying was the most important information she'd received all day. When he finished, the silence was different from the silence before. Cleaner. "I came west because I was suffocating," she said after a moment. "Everything in Boston was correct and arranged and expected, and I was expected along with everything else. A proper life in a proper cage with proper locks." She looked at her hands. "I wanted a horizon, something that didn't end where someone else decided it should." Cole looked at her. "Did you find it?" She considered the question with genuine honesty. "I think I'm still looking," she said, "but I'm looking in the right direction." The lantern between them guttered slightly in a draft. They both reached to steady it at the same moment, her fingers and his hand meeting at the base of the glass, neither one moving away. The contact was brief and unplanned and entirely without agenda, which made it more significant than anything calculated could have been. A child stirred in the corner. They both withdrew their hands. The silence that followed was warm rather than empty, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. By mid-morning, the water had receded enough that Cole and his men rode out to find half the south pasture fence down, and cattle scattered across 3 miles of open range. The financial damage was serious. He rode without stopping, jaw set, already calculating. What he didn't see, because he was gone before it began, was Aina standing in the center of town 2 hours later with Mrs. Finch on one side and 6 ranch families in front of her, organizing a search effort with the calm authority of someone who had spent all night keeping 17 children safe and had simply continued in the same direction. She divided them into pairs, assigned sections of range, requisitioned horses from the livery, and had the whole group moving within 30 minutes. By late afternoon, nearly all the cattle had been found and driven back through a hastily repaired section of fence by a collection of townspeople who mostly didn't know what they were doing, but had been told clearly enough to manage. Cole returned to find his herd largely intact and a note on his fence post in neat, familiar handwriting. Chapter 7 also covers emergency herd recovery. "You're welcome." He stood in the fading light holding the note, and something very close to a smile threatened the corner of his mouth. It didn't quite arrive, but it was close. Mayor Whitfield's rumor reached Aina on a Thursday morning through the nervous, apologetic mouth of the school board secretary, who twisted her handkerchief and couldn't meet her eyes. The implication was delicate but unmistakable, that Aina's association with Cole Hargrove, the overnight storm incident particularly, reflected poorly on her standing as a teacher and a lady, and that the school board was concerned. Aina set down her chalk. She walked to Mayor Whitfield's office, opened the door without knocking, and closed it behind her. What she said inside was not heard by anyone in the hallway, but the mayor's secretary reported that the conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes, that Miss Aina's voice remained level throughout, and that when she emerged her posture was perfect and her expression was pleasantly composed, while the mayor behind her looked as though he'd been neatly dismantled and left in a pile. "Good morning," Aina said to the secretary on her way out and walked back to school. By sundown, Cole had heard everything. He was already reaching for his best shirt. Cole rode into Redstone Bluff on a Friday morning with his best shirt pressed, and his jaw set in the particular way that made sensible people find somewhere else to be. He tied his horse at the post outside the general store, took his hat off, put it back on, and walked toward the center of town with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had made up his mind somewhere between the ranch and the creek crossing and hadn't reconsidered since. Word traveled ahead of him the way it always did. By the time he reached the open ground in front of the town hall, a small natural audience had assembled, not gathered exactly, but drifted, the way people drift toward anything that has the atmosphere of consequence. Mrs. Finch was among them, apron still on, having apparently left mid-task. Pete Morrow stood outside his store. 3 cowboys leaned against the water trough with studied casualness that fooled no one. Mayor Whitfield was crossing the street with 2 members of the school board when Cole stopped in front of him. Cole was not a man who made speeches. He had the rancher's deep suspicion of words used in large quantities, having observed that people who talked the most usually meant the least. So what he said was brief and quiet, and landed with the absolute precision of a man who had spent 34 years only speaking when he had something worth saying. He said that the schoolteacher had spent a storm night protecting every child in that building, while their parents couldn't reach them. He said she had organized the cattle recovery that saved a significant portion of his herd without being asked and without seeking credit. He said that her character was not a subject open for speculation by men who had done neither of those things, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was welcome to bring their concerns directly to him at the ranch, at any hour, and he would be happy to discuss it at length. He looked at the mayor steadily for a moment after that, in the way that a closed gate is a statement rather than a question. The mayor discovered he had nothing further to add. The school board members exchanged a look. The senior member, a straight-backed woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who had always been the most sensible person on the board and who had voted against Whitfield's interference from the beginning, gave a single decisive nod. "Miss Aina's position is confirmed," she said crisply, to no one and everyone. "This matter is closed." Mrs. Finch exhaled audibly. Cole turned then, because the thing he'd come to town to do was only half finished, and it was the more difficult half. Aina was standing at the edge of the gathered townspeople. She had arrived, as best anyone could tell, sometime during his second sentence, having come from the direction of the schoolhouse with a shawl over her arm and a look on her face that was carefully composed and not entirely successful at concealing what was happening beneath it. Her dark eyes were very bright. Her chin was level. Cole crossed the distance between them. He stopped a proper 2 feet away, which was the frontier's version of standing very close. He was not, by nature, a man comfortable in the territory of open feeling. He had lived for 3 years behind walls he'd built quickly and maintained rigorously, and standing here in the middle of Redstone Bluff with 40-odd people watching and his heart conducting itself with absolutely no discipline whatsoever was not a condition he had anticipated finding himself in when he'd woken up that morning. But he was also a man who, when the fence was down, fixed it. "I'm not good at this," he said, which was perhaps the most honest sentence he'd spoken in years. "I know," she said. "Go ahead anyway." He looked at her steadily. You're the best thing that's walked into this town in a long time, possibly ever, and I've been a fool about it for reasons that belong to me and shouldn't have been taken out on you." He paused. "I'd like to call on you properly if you're willing. I'd understand if you weren't." The street was completely silent. A horse shifted somewhere behind the crowd. A child sneezed and was frantically shushed by its mother. Aina regarded him for a moment with those quietly perceptive eyes, and then the corner of her mouth curved. "I have one condition," she said. He waited. "Smile," she said. "A real one." The silence stretched. Cole looked at her, at this woman who had spilled tea on his best shirt and apologized without flinching, who had read to frightened children through a storm, who had returned a land management book with the spine worn at chapter 7, who had walked into a mayor's office and closed the door and come out with her posture perfect, who had sat with him in lamplight and listened to him say Sarah's name as though it mattered that he'd said it. It started slowly, the way any true thing starts. A shift at the corner of his mouth, an easing of the long-held lines around his eyes, unpracticed, slightly uneven, real in the way that only unpracticed things can be. Cole Hargrove smiled. The crowd exhaled as one. Mrs. Finch pressed both hands to her face and made a sound that was not quite a word. Pete Morrow took his hat off. The three cowboys at the water trough stood up straight without realizing they'd done it. "Better," Aina said softly. "Don't push it," he said, still smiling. She laughed, warm and unguarded, and he looked at her laughing, and the smile stayed. He called on her properly that Sunday. He arrived at the boarding house at the agreed-upon hour with his hat in his hands, and a small, wrapped parcel that turned out to contain a jar of good tea from the catalog, which Mrs. Finch later declared to be the most romantic gesture she had witnessed in 30 years of running a boarding house. They walked to the creek, which had calmed considerably since the storm, and sat on a flat rock in the thin autumn sunshine. Cole had brought jerky. Aina had brought bread, cheese, a small jar of preserved peaches, and 2 proper cups. He looked at her provisions and then at his own and had the self-awareness to look slightly embarrassed. "I can contribute jerky," he said. "You contribute jerky," she confirmed graciously. "I'll handle the rest." He handed her his jerky. She handed him a peach. They sat in a comfortable, unforced quiet beside the water, talking when they had something to say and not talking when they didn't, which is the specific ease of 2 people who have moved past performing at each other and arrived somewhere more honest. Tommy, who had been brought along and immediately given permission to explore the creek bank, reappeared periodically to report findings: a peculiar rock, a frog of impressive size, evidence of what he believed to be a beaver, before vanishing again. Watching him, Cole was quiet for a moment in a way that was full rather than empty. "He's doing better," Aina said. "He is," Cole agreed. He paused. "You did that." "He did that," she said. "I just refused to let him do otherwise." Cole looked at her sideways. She was watching Tommy scramble along the bank with her chin propped on her hand, content and unhurried. The afternoon light was the particular gold of late October, the kind that makes ordinary things look like they've been painted by someone who loved them. "That's generally your approach," he observed. She turned to look at him. "Is it working?" He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said, "it is." The autumn gathering was held 3 weeks later in the same town hall, with the same paper banner. Mrs. Finch had saved it, patched one torn corner, and rehung it on the grounds that it had earned its place. There was dancing this time, and good food, and a warmth to the evening that had more to do with the people in the room than the stove in the corner. Aina was at the refreshment table. She was pouring tea. She felt Cole before she saw him, that same atmospheric shift, the room adjusting around him, and looked up to find him making his way toward her through the crowd. He was wearing his best shirt, the new one. She had noticed some weeks back that he'd acquired a second-best shirt, which Mrs. Finch informed her was entirely unprecedented in the history of Cole Hargrove's wardrobe. He stopped on the other side of the table. She picked up a full cup, crossed to his side, and placed it directly in his hand without spilling a single drop. Then she stepped back and looked at him with evident satisfaction. "See," she said, "I've improved." Cole looked down at his shirt, dry, unstained, entirely uncompromised. Then he looked at her. Something moved across his expression that was warmer than amusement and quieter than joy, and lived in the particular country between them that had no name yet but was being mapped, slowly and carefully, by two people who had both waited long enough to trust it. "Shame," he said quietly. "I think I like the other way better." He smiled. It came easier this time, a little less rusty, a little more fluent, as though the muscle was remembering what it was for. She smiled back, and for a moment the noise and warmth of the room carried on around them while they stood inside a pocket of stillness that belonged entirely to them. Later, when the dancing had started and the lamps were warm and Tommy had fallen asleep in a chair in the corner with his boots still on, Aina and Cole stood together on the schoolhouse porch across the way, looking out at the prairie. The night sky over Texas was extravagant, more stars than any Boston parlor ceiling could have suggested existed, spread from one flat horizon to the other in a kind of wild, uncontainable abundance. The air was cold and clean and smelled of grass and distance. Tommy's silhouette was visible through the lit window behind them, small and sleeping and safe. Aina pulled her shawl close. Cole stood beside her, close enough that the space between them was a choice rather than a distance. She was not looking at a beautiful cage. She was looking at a horizon that went on and opened rather than ended, wide as the sky above it, full of weather and difficulty and the particular dailiness of a life that meant something. She had come west looking for this. She hadn't known exactly what shape it would take. She thought she was beginning to understand its shape. Beside her, Cole was quiet in the way he was quiet now, not the locked, weighted silence of before, but something breathable. He was looking at the same sky. After a while he said, without preamble or explanation, the way he said most things, "Glad you spilled that tea." Aina turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "So am I," she said. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, golden and dark and vast, and somewhere out in the distance a night bird called once and was answered, and the stars continued their ancient, indifferent burning overhead. And in Redstone Bluff, Texas, in the autumn of 1874, two people stood on a porch in the good dark and breathed.